Vinay Hiremath. On this episode, we are honored to welcome Vinay Hiremath, co-founder and CTO of Loom, where he oversees the company's technical direction and architecture. Named to Forbes 30 Under 30 list in 2017, Vinay has a wealth of experience in service architecture and distributed systems. Before founding Loom, Vinay worked at Up There and interned at Facebook, where he contributed to optimizing the mobile web composer. With a background in computer science from the University of Illinois, Vinay's expertise and vision has been instrumental in Loom's success, culminating in its acquisition by Atlassian in the fall of 2023. Please join us in welcoming Vinay Hiremath.
Thanks, Johnny. Really appreciate everyone coming. Excited to chat. I think before we get to the main event, would love to quickly talk a little bit about Studio and then do a really quick kind of macro overview of kind of what's happening and how it relates to fundraising. Really quickly on me, started out in finance, was at private equity and at hedge funds, and then about a decade ago left to run my own hedge fund. And as part of that process, took a step back, looked at how I was using different tools and what my workflow looked like, and realized, wow, Bloomberg is really bad, and I need to build my own. And so in that process, rather than launching a fund, went on a founder's journey of building a financial search engine called Sentio. Originally just for myself, I was the only client for the first 4 years. And then over time, we scaled to a couple thousand clients, raised about $70 million, and kind of grew the team to about 400 people. So it was kind of a full cycle journey from sort of start to then we kind of exited a couple of years ago to a business called AlphaSense. And that business, the combined business now is expected to go public next year. So really exciting to kind of see it from idea all the way through to kind of a big team and an exit. And I think we try to bring that same approach to what we do at Studio. At Studio, at a high level, it's a hedge fund and it's a venture fund. I think most of the folks here are kind of more interested on the venture side. And there we start at kind of incubating our own companies like Sentio, all the way to later stage stuff and everything in between. Our sweet spot really is kind of seed, pre-seed. And so would love to chat with folks who are in that stage or thinking about being in that stage. And we have a lot of folks kind of in the room today. If Ari, Natalie, Jacob could also raise their hands so folks can see, definitely come chat with any of them, as well as me and Johnny. But the idea really is that, hey, we've been on the journey before, and so we can partner with you, but also have that empathy to understand what it takes to build a company and, all the ups and, there's a lot more downs than the folks at TechCrunch will let on and others. So, happy to chat about all of that. And then the other thing that we do is we incubate companies ourselves, just like Sentio. And the idea there is that we like to do things that, are our own problems and really scratch our own itches. And so Sentio is one example of that in the financial services space. The other key one that we've scaled over the last decade is a business called Thistle, which Johnny and I and a couple other folks co-founded. And the idea there was we were just really unhealthy. We were ordering way too much DoorDash. And, of course, being me, rather than like solving that problem by learning to cook, I decided to solve it at scale by building kind of a subscription meal plan service where it's primarily plant-based. You can add animal protein on if you want, but you just essentially put your diet on autopilot. We show up a couple times a week, and the rest is kind of taken care of. And at least for me, then I cheat nights and weekends, and it's kind of a great balance. And so same thing, now we're investing in kind of new companies and building new companies ourselves, but it's that underlying idea that, hey, we've been on the journey before, and especially those two kind of verticals, the first being kind of fintech and SaaS with Sentio, and then kind of DTC consumer with Thistle, are the places that we really have a lot of experience and love to kind of share that experience as well. So that's really studio management at a high level. Before we jump into the chat, really quickly wanted to give folks my view. For those of you who've been coming for a while, I like to kind of just do a quick macroeconomic overview of kind of what we're seeing in the markets, how it relates to tech, how it relates to especially kind of folks in the tech industry and fundraising. It's been a very interesting few years. Obviously, COVID kicked off a very, very bubbly period during the pandemic. Rates were at zero. In general, rates at zero means that there's lots and lots of cash gushing around. And, I think most people made very good use of that. A lot of people fundraised. Then because of COVID, essentially we had a bunch of inflation come through that took rates very, very high, north of 5%. And that typically has a very negative effect on risk tolerance. And if you think about it, tech companies are the furthest thing out on risk tolerance. It's the most risk, obviously the most return and reward as well. But that meant that the funding raising environment really dried up. It was really hard to raise for a while, and I think most people were just kind of in turtle mode. Luckily, over the past year, inflation has come back down. I wouldn't say that we're anywhere near back to kind of the 2021 exuberance, but the markets are back, and especially anything related to AI is very, very hot, as you'd expect. I'm sure a lot of you founders have all thought about, hey, can I just cram AI into anything in my pitch? It's sad, but that's really kind of the world we're in. But that is obviously leading to a lot of investment, a lot of kind of renewed interest in ventures and asset class, but also dollars for businesses. And the reality is most businesses can use AI and really leverage that. And so I think it's very positive in that sense. We are at a really interesting juncture right now, however, where after inflation coming down, people thinking, hey, inflation is potentially tamed. Just today, we had the third hot CPI print in a row. The markets really didn't react well to it. More importantly than the markets, bonds really got hit pretty hard. And so it's not clear if it's a trend or not, but it certainly seems like we're past kind of the really low inflation days. And now if inflation stays here, I think we're fine, and the markets will do okay. If inflation continues to go higher from here, I think it could be a problem, and that will really crimp the dollars that are available for technology. My suspicion is that the Fed is running the economy really hot intentionally, and they want inflation to be a little bit hotter intentionally because, if I look at what's happened, the reason this happened essentially is back in December, the Fed said, well, hey, we're going to cut rates way more than anyone expects. And that really pumped up the economy. I don't think it's because the Fed was actually going to cut rates that many times. It was because the Fed doesn't want to see Donald Trump in November. They're not a neutral party, despite that's what they're supposed to be. And so the easiest way to tip the scales for Biden is to run the economy hot, have higher, a little bit higher inflation, but also just higher GDP growth and more jobs. And so I think they're following through on that. Now, the real question will be, do they end up cutting rates at all this year? Because if they do cut rates, the markets will be very, very excited. The markets just love rate cuts. But if they don't, it could be a little bit tougher. I suspect they're going to try and sneak at least one cut in before September, October, when it'll be harder because the election will be in view. But I think post the election, I think they will change their tune, and we will kind of bring back a little bit on the demand, and in the process, hopefully inflation will come down. But it is a really interesting juncture today in the markets. From a fundraising perspective, I think not a lot has changed. I think people are still deploying capital pretty aggressively, and I wouldn't expect that to change unless rates essentially go above 5, and they're at 4.5 now. So we're close, but we're not there. Okay, so happy to take questions on any of this stuff at the end, but would love to kind of jump into the main show here. So would love to just start by just understanding kind of your founder's journey. What were you doing before, and sort of what sort of drove you to start Loom?
Yeah, for sure. There we go. Cool. How's everybody doing? Good? Awesome. That's really interesting. I never thought about the election sort of narrative with the Fed. Founder's journey. So how did I get started? Well, so Loom started, how many people here have used Loom or heard about it? Okay, that's fucking wild. For anybody who hasn't used it or hasn't heard about it, it's basically a screen recorder that's hooked up to the cloud. It's kind of wild how far it's come. You can record your screen and yourself in a little camera bubble, narrate these videos, and you can use it for everything from onboarding to sales outbounding to product demos to bug reports. And it really took off in a number of different waves. We got really lucky on multiple different macro and technological fronts. Looking back on it, you can see that now. But the way it started, honestly, was me and my two co-founders going out for a night at Venice Beach, and we were super fucked up, and we got back. One of my co-founders was throwing up over the couch. I ended up cleaning up his throw up that night, and we were just smoking cigarettes outside, and we were really unhappy with the leadership at the companies that we worked at. We felt like they were making a bunch of mistakes that were avoidable mistakes. And we realized we had a really good distribution of skill sets, between product, engineering, design, and we were, uber nerds. So we just thought about products all the time. And so we're like, well, maybe we can start by just thinking about different markets and what can get disrupted. We ended up doing the first meeting. It went terribly. we like 5 minutes in, one of my co-founders, Shahid, was like, well, user testing really sucks. I don't know if you guys have done user testing. We're like, yeah, you send it to this company, usertesting.com. Half the people, I don't even know if they're legally allowed to drive, but they can't even submit an onboarding flow. We're like, this is fucking terrible. Like, there should be a better way to do user testing. And so instead of like really thinking about the market and hyper-analyzing it, we're like, let's just go build it. And so we started iterating through the user testing space as open test. And through basically a series of 5 or 6 different pivots in the user testing space, we all lived together. We were pulling like 16-hour nights. The story's pretty common. I still won't touch Adderall or modafinil from that time. I'm like super scarred. And we pivoted and we shipped a bunch, and we eventually got a few different companies, but one in particular, we ended up getting Harvard's UXR and research team to use our user testing platform to get video guided feedback from people remotely. And the head of the research group ended up using our tool to record an overview distilling what happened in all of the videos. And he was like, why can't I just like do this by itself? It was kind of a mix of that and a lot more as to why we ended up decoupling our Chrome extension from the user testing platform. But when we did that, we ended up shipping on Product Hunt in 2016. And basically overnight, we ended up having more signups, like 1,000 times more signups than we did the entire history of like the last 6-7 months. And so we had kind of like landed on a product market fit, like inkling feeling. And that's really how Loom started. I mean, there's a lot that's in it around like remote work taking off even before the pandemic, internet access unilaterally rising globally. Consumer was starting to adopt video. This is right around the time that Instagram Stories was launched and people were using Snapchat. TikTok hadn't even been released. And so consumer usually leads enterprise by about 6 to 7 years over the past 20, 25 years of internet companies. And so we got really lucky on a bunch of fronts. But it was a mix of just like iterating, figuring out what is our hypothesis about the world and what problems people need to solve. And the thing is that, when you start, your hypothesis about what problems actually exist in the world is probably wrong, right? Like everybody here thinks they have a great idea and then they try to go execute on it. And it's like, actually this person's not the buyer. The buyer really sucks. They like have these other ties with people. And so, really what you're doing in those early stages is you're trying to build up a worldview and hypothesis, and you're trying to find a market, and you're trying to iterate within both of those things and then land on something that actually works. And so we didn't know we were going to, build an async video tool, but that's how it ended up happening.
Super interesting. Thanks for sharing that. And how did you think about it? Like, how many times did you end up quote unquote pivoting versus where you started?
We ended up pivoting like 5 big pivots, I'd say. And at that time, there was an expectation between me and my co-founders. We're like, we're gonna like, what is our commitment level? And our commitment level was like just living together, switching off with the master bedroom, which was really nice. That had like not an inflatable bed. And we're like, we're going all in on this,
All in means no mattresses in the other rooms? Or air mattresses only?
Air mattresses, yeah, air mattresses. There was a couch, and it was like a really shitty couch, It was like, we bought it off Craigslist for like $100, so it's pretty bad.
Love it.
Yeah.
And then curious, obviously there is this question of an iteration, which is so important in startups. It's kind of the one thing that the startup has that larger companies don't have that advantage, right? That you can always, it's tough, right? Even if you're in a 2, 3, 5 person organization, you've been working on something for 6 months. It's really hard to say, hey, we're not going to like completely, burn the boats, but we're going to substantially change. The bigger you get, the harder it gets. And once you get to a real size business, even like 30, 40 people, really, really hard. So it's kind of like the secret power of startups, especially in the early stages. Curious how you kind of see that now when you do a lot of investing in on the angel side. So, how you kind of do pattern recognition on those things and work with some of the founders that you work with.
Yeah, for sure. Well, I'm like self-described. I describe like the Loom leadership team as kind of like a bunch of hippie capitalists. And so like my investment thesis is like really fucking great sometimes and then like terrible most of the time. So I invest off a few different things. I'd say that like the capital that's the scarcest at big companies is the courage to take on a new market, right? Like it's not that you don't have enough money, you have a ton of money. It's that you don't see an opportunity in a market and it's too small to show promise over long time horizons, especially when you're public. And so for me, I look for founders who are like honestly willing to work all the time. I'm not looking for lifestyle founders. I'm looking for founders who are highly technical. That's something that I just personally focus on. Within AI, I think right now I basically categorize the AI space into two different buckets. One is people who are creating structure out of like a bunch of data that already exists out there on the internet, wherever else. You can buy these data sets from other companies, silos, or companies that are building devices in the real world or online that collects a bunch of data that it didn't make sense to collect before because there was just no commercial viability. So within AI, that's kind of how I split those two things. But I also invest like in everything from, SaaS, which I do probably less of now, all the way to like nuclear and hard tech. So I'm looking for like the founder knowledge set, drive, hypothesis about the market and connecting it to technology. It's mostly.
Makes sense.
Yeah.
And I think we were chatting a little bit before earlier about you had just recently read Innovator's Dilemma.
Yeah.
I think that's a nice segue to sort of think about, especially why big companies can't do some of these things and the unfair advantage that startups have. So if you maybe want to explain to the audience the thesis of the book, and then we can get into it a little bit.
100%. So, I mean, the thesis of the book, basically, the author ended up looking at a bunch of different markets. He ended up looking at the hard disk market, which is, not very exciting, but he makes it exciting. And he looks at like all of the technological advances that increased, power and storage density at odds with cost a lot of times. And he looks at the different tranches of companies that succeeded and failed during all of these different spikes. And the reason he does that is because the hard disk market is notorious for just churning out a ton of high capex companies very quickly. And so it's a really like interesting market to look at. And basically the notion of the book can be distilled down to like one thing, which is that when there are competing products that enter the market at first, they're competing on performance of the product. Then they usually compete on convenience. Once you have buyers, once you have people using your product, you're starting to think about, okay, how do I make my current product more convenient to my current customers? And then they eventually compete on price, which means your product is totally commoditized. It's super easy to make it. And the nature of all of the markets that you enter in, especially in tech and data, the nature of data is to be free. And so everything gets commoditized over time. And basically the innovator's dilemma can be distilled down to that. The way that I think about it as I'm like at Atlassian, Jira and Confluence are like not very good products, right? And so this is not like a secret at Atlassian. It's not like you walk in and people are like, what? Like Confluence is not a good product? And so they're kind of in an interesting place where they've sold these products to enterprises and a bunch of enterprises are entrenched in the products. And at one point, it was the highest performing product. But now if you were to ask anybody, they're probably going to use Notion or Linear, right? Those are higher performance products. But the convenience for large enterprise teams is really diminished when you go to these products because they don't have all of the functionality that you need for governance, for compliance, for all these things that are like smaller stage companies don't have to worry about. But they are going to lose out on the SMB and early markets if they don't make a better product. And so it's really interesting because they acquired Loom because we sell into go-to-market groups in a way that they don't currently. But in order for them to attach Confluence and Jira and sell into the same customers we have, they have to have a better product than Notion and Linear, right? Or at least as good. And so it's just like another example of the innovator's dilemma at work where it's like they were competing on price for a while. And if you go to Jira or Confluence's site, it's the cheapest products out there, but they suck to use. And it's the same thing for Microsoft Teams. Microsoft Teams is a piece of shit product. It's terrible. I'm sorry if you have to use it, but it's terrible. But it's really cheap. And if you consolidate into Microsoft's ecosystem, no one's going to get fired for buying IBM, right? And so right now, it's interesting. You see where people are on this innovator's dilemma of like product performance, integrations and convenience, and then price. And companies constantly shift. And so actually, one of the things that I think Atlassian's doing a really good job of is just being eyes wide open. They're like an open company, no bullshit, and they're very well aware of this problem. But that's generally the innovator's dilemma, you know?
Yeah, it's a great book, great Clayton Christensen. The other way that I think it's really interesting to think about the way that book describes what's happening with tech and what happens with disruption is we can use like the Jira example. You know, Jira is the incumbent. The slope of kind of the curve of like how their product improves looks like this. And like when Linear first got released, it was way down here. But and the reason that it takes so long is because even if it's coming up the curve like this, it takes many, many years to build. But once you start getting close to the point of intersection between the two curves, then there's a huge amount of opportunity for disruption because typically the new product is built in a different way. It can be priced more attractively, and obviously it has a lot more features. And most importantly, the shape of the curve in terms of its like value, call it its cost versus its actual product is increasing much more quickly. And once you get close to where those two curves intersect, a huge amount of market share can go away from the incumbents. And so, same thing. We used to use Jira. We're on Linear now, and I think it's a couple of years from where that will become a real issue for a lot of folks.
Right.
And so obviously folks are aware. And so in technology, it's a little bit different because you can adapt and like you can kind of refactor your code base. In some of these other hardware products, like the hard disks and like the tractors he talks about, it's much harder, right? You have the product you have. But I think the best example for me in recent times is what's happened with Adobe and both Figma and Canva. I'm sure everybody in this room is using one or both of those products. And so and what that's done is it's actually it's kind of commoditized and democratized doing design in a lot of ways. Whereas you needed to have the dark arts of Adobe Photoshop and things like that to be able to kind of design those things. And now any of us in this room can, and even more so as all of this becomes now conversational and generative AI, it gets easier and easier. And so I think the interesting thing that's happening now is the speed at which technology is improving, the speed at which AI is now improving. What used to be like a curve that looked like this could actually start looking like this for a lot of different products. And that's hugely bullish for a lot of startups being able to sort of unseat incumbents. So I think that's probably a great transition to talk about AI. Obviously, it's kind of on everyone's mind all the time now, and it's only going to get worse in that sense. But we'd love to understand, what you guys are working on at Loom when it comes to AI and what you're most excited about.
For sure. Well, so for the past 3 months now, I've been dropping in unofficially on an intro to ML course at Columbia. And it's really funny because I'm like very obviously way older than everybody else there, It's kind of like the "Hey fellow kids, 30 Rock" meme, where like I'm walking around and people are like, who is this person that's like sitting in our courses? But it's been really eye-opening to like kind of get a really low-level view of like the math, like what is actually going on here, like what does it mean to map a distribution to another distribution? And then it's also been really interesting to build an applied AI team at Loom. Loom has, we're ingesting many petabytes of data every single week, conversational video data. This type of video content doesn't exist anywhere else online. And the reason for that is because all of the video data that exists publicly is made for presentation, right? So like if we're recording this right now, the way I'm talking right now, if I talked like this to my girlfriend every day, she'd be like, what is going on? Like, who's the Agent Smith that I'm in a relationship with, So the reason that when you use a lot of these like video models, it sounds very robotic. It sounds very like processed. Loom has an immense amount of conversational data that is just super informal. We have the biggest opportunity to create synthetic audio and video that sounds and looks like you. Obviously, that's like really scary too. There's a bunch of ramifications there. But the way we're going to be employing it is to make video easier to create, edit, polish. If you don't get things right on that first hit, if you want to like create, one video and personalize it at scale, a lot of the solutions that exist today, it's just like it's very obvious when they use an AI generated product. And some of the stuff we're doing internally, it is not obvious at all. And so we're actually spending a lot of time thinking about the responsibility of releasing this stuff. And so that's kind of, that's where we're focused on internally at Loom right now is, LLMs are able to treat documents as like higher order editing bits. You're able to, take a prompt and be like, make this sound better or more robust, make me sound more confident. The question is, well, can you do that and then have that update in a video as well? And what does that look like in the future? What does it mean for like, if you were to embed, your product demo and then someone visits your website and you were to like play the video and it's like, it just plays in their native language automatically. There's like a bunch of stuff that you can do with this. And so we have like a pretty big roadmap that we're building against with a team of applied AI researchers. That was a lot. I don't even know if I answered your question, but I've been thinking about AI a lot.
I know it's too much.
It is.
It's really only going to get worse.
Well, I think, I was having a conversation with someone and I really think like the advent of AI, I know this is going to like be eye-rolly for a lot of people who think it's like overblown. It definitely is like overhyped right now in the application space, but I really think that this is more akin to like the creation of agriculture than it actually is to like the creation of the internet. And so a lot of people are like hinging on this as like, what are the new applications that can be created? But like, we're not even talking about embodied AI and the number of robots and like other field working agents that are going to be in the real world. We're not even thinking about what does it look like to be able to, do Uber, but for everything in your life. What does it look like to replace China's multi-trillion-dollar repeatable workforce? I think that we'll see it play out. But yeah, it's a lot, and we're just at the beginning. We're at the very early layers of this.
It's the first inning. People are just beginning to figure out what to do with it, but I don't know what the folks in this room, like, first of all, like how many of you are using Google 30% or more, or 30% less than you were before? Wow. 50%? Wow. Very, very interesting. So it's funny, again, like markets and pundits like to, they gotta sell copies, right? And so people are of course gonna complain that like, where is the breakthrough application? We haven't seen like a new breakthrough application in terms of something that just does something completely new, other than like ChatGPT and maybe something like a Perplexity. But it's very clear. I think this room is obviously at the bleeding edge, but nonetheless, the amount that folks are using things that are not Google to get their core information is very clear. But the thing that's most crazy is like, we run a hedge fund. One of our largest positions is NVIDIA. We've owned it for a couple of years, and that business has 10x'd. The reason it's 10x is because like its revenue has 10x'd in a few years, and that's because they're the only guy. I mean, Jensen is like a decade ahead of everybody else. It seems like I often joke, but if Jensen really wanted to be like a G, he could just not sell anyone any compute, and then he would 100% get to AGI first, right?
I mean, I don't know how many people. I don't know if you've seen his interview at the Stanford Graduate School of Business, but I didn't know that he was just like creating markets. So it's like, imagine if your strategy was like, we have to go create this market to like sell them our product. I mean, their whole thesis was, what kind of chip can we create that does compute workloads more efficiently that doesn't exist on like a normal pipeline processor? It's like, I mean, that to do that for like 20 years and just be like, okay, we see incremental progress.
It's the best like innovator's dilemma story ever. Like, it took 20 years, but they're like 20 years ahead of everybody else. And the market has now recognized that. And so the market is obviously ripped NVIDIA stock, but together with NVIDIA stock, like almost every other semiconductor company is coming along for the ride. And the reason for that is, again, there's some amount of speculation in there, but really all these companies' revenues are exploding. Because we're in the first inning of like the biggest like tech build out the world has ever seen in terms of just more and more and more silicon. And whether or not that gets us to AGI and what you want to call AGI, the amount of sort of silicon intelligence that's coming out of that and the speed at which that is improving is just, it's mind boggling. Just for my own workflow, like the kind of things that like I can do today, even versus 6 months ago, it's crazy. And this is still without something that has kind of been that quantum leap that I'm sure is coming by the end of this year, both in terms of where the foundational models are going, but I think more importantly, where the application layer ends up from those foundational models to porting to the places where you work the most, your desktop and especially your phone. And stay tuned, we're working on something there too. but it's mind-boggling. And so I think the problem with humans is we just don't know how to think in exponentials, and we're right at like the beginning of this exponential. And so really exciting, but also really scary in terms of how much our society is completely going to be upended as part of this, and one where like our political economy just is not ready at all.
No.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Any sort of advice to founders in the AI realm in terms of how they can apply AI to whatever they're doing, assuming that you're not building like a foundational model, but more of an application?
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the most underutilized, I don't know if anybody saw this article about Klarna and how they like revamped all of their support, all of their ops to basically reduce COGS by, what was it, like 50% and increase, ARR by like some crazy multiple. I forgot, multiple hundreds. And but I think the most underutilized application of AI right now is just applying the tooling to your own team. It's like even Loom is like far behind here. I mean, and there's a bunch of companies that don't even give their teams access to like Copilot and ChatGPT, which is crazy to me. So that's the first like non-sexy answer. I think the second one is I really do think about if you're building for like within the AI space, it's like within the two buckets of there's a bunch of unstructured information that we're now going to structure, or there's a bunch of unstructured information out there that we're going to collect and structure. Like, which one do you fall into? And I would really push people to think about this. I was talking to Amjad, the founder of Replit, about this, and we were just like, every single AI startup we see falls into one of these two categories. And so where are you? And then like, what is your data advantage over time will help you understand the competitive landscape and where things go. But I think it's really easy to feel discouraged right now with all the advancements that are happening in AI and be like, well, what's the point of me building anything? But the truth is that none of us know what we're talking about here. It's like things are advancing so quickly that you got to start somewhere. I would just try to think about what are the buckets that you fall into? What is your data moat? If you don't have one now, where is it going to be? And one that's really interesting to think about that I don't know how many people are thinking about this type of data moat, but there are a lot of products that are going to be like multi-agent, where the more usage of that product will create more data that creates a sort of synthetic network effect for the product. And so even if you don't have that data moat now, you might be building a network within your product that gives you the advantage if you're a first mover. And so I wouldn't be totally discouraged and say, oh, well, I can't buy a bunch of data. I don't have a bunch of data, so there's no point. The application of your product, if it is much better than what exists out there today, the usage of it itself could increase your advantage. And so I don't know if that's really advice. I think my basic advice would be, honestly, one is to like minimize Twitter usage and scrolling. I think that like if you're a founder, I mean, it is fucking hard. Like you are, you're basically trying to do something that everybody is like, don't do that, and like you have to convince yourself that that is a good idea over and over again. And it's amazing how many founders I know who just wake up and open Twitter and open Instagram. It's like the problems will come, like you don't need to create problems for yourself. So my number one piece of feedback, especially now where the world is so fucking crazy and you're like, oh, like OpenAI just killed my startup. Minimize your time online. Like try to be really intentional about the information you consume and build, because that's the only thing that's going to save you in the end anyway. It's not going to be worrying about whether or not you're going to get disrupted. And so obviously have a hypothesis from there. I would think about that 2 different data bucket, build up your worldview, try to figure out what problem you're solving, and then figure out why you're wrong over time and keep iterating on that. And so those would honestly be my 2 biggest pieces of feedback. It's just like control social media usage. I think that's like honestly the biggest vector of founders not existing. I mean, you look at like, I'm a millennial, so I have nothing in common with Gen Z, honestly. But you look at Gen Z and it's like they're not hyped about anything, and it sucks. And it's like you have to be hyped about shit to build really meaningful stuff. And you try to figure out, well, why are they not hyped? they're just glued to TikTok. Like they look like zombies. They're just like scrolling all the time. And so honestly, it's like, I think it's possibly the most important advice I could give is to limit social media use.
Thanks, Dad.
Yeah, 100%. I mean, I just moved to Brooklyn Heights. I'm like full in like thinking about kids. And so I'm in that mode. That's for sure.
I mean, it's totally fair. It's crazy how much they're warping our minds and how much worse it's gonna get. Same thing, right?
You just can't make good decisions if you don't have good emotions, and like working out, limiting, basically this vector of attack, just a bunch of people sending a bunch of angry tweets at you and whatever else, showing you how great their life is. It's like, yeah.
Makes sense. To dovetail on the second point, it is interesting that I think, I feel the same existential angst as everyone else around, like, I'm building this thing, but, all these foundational models are moving so quickly, and, what does it actually mean? The flip side is it's pretty heartening if you think about it that, ChatGPT has been out for, a year and a half or something now, and doesn't seem like there's been like a breakthrough product other than ChatGPT itself or a wrapper thereof. And so the whole, William H. Gibson quote, like, the future is here, it's just unevenly distributed. It's extremely unevenly distributed when it comes to AI. And especially if you go to like other cities, other countries, there's a very clear gradient where most folks are not as sort of advanced as folks in New York. But the other thing is the age gradient is crazy, right? You talk to someone in their 50s, like, they're not using any of these things. You talk to someone in their 20s, like, they're glued to it. And so all of those things provide opportunities as well for startups, which at the end of the day, early in a startup's life, it's just a version of what you were talking about, right? You have an idea, you're looking for niches, you just want to be in that niche and like just hammer it, own that niche. And then once you own a niche, you get, momentum, and the momentum can take you to lots of other places. And so, despite everything that's happening with AI, at the end of the day, like, most humans, most users are still going to access all these things via front ends that do their own thing, that have a specific point of view. And so a lot of opportunity still to build those, as well as, the thing that you forget as if you're a product-driven founder, which I am, is, and I tell this to like most of our portfolio companies, is like, product is like, I wish product was the most important thing. It's like the third most important thing. Unfortunately, we live in a world of sales and marketing, right? So there's a huge amount of kind of differentiated things you can do there as well. And a lot of that is driven by being early, being first, having a point of view, and then, that's the one place where maybe you should have a social following.
For sure. I mean, I have a social following. It's like I feel like
How many followers?
I'm a hypocrite. So, but yeah.
Okay, let's open it up for questions from the audience. Go ahead. Yeah, go ahead.
So this question about like a data moat or just moats in general has always kind of been a bullshit question for me. You tell me if you disagree. But I'm curious for both of you. If you were starting your company today, what would be your answer to the moat question?
Well, before we answer that, I would love to answer with an amazing tweet I saw, which is, stop asking me this question. The answer is, I have the mandate of heaven.
Well, I mean, I think that I actually think that there were, okay, how do I state this? So I think that we're talking about interest rates, right? There's a bunch of money that was printed, and I look at interest rates as almost like the gas pedal of how much capital is deployed. And there's actually a bunch of capital that's just like sitting around. So when people say that funding is dried up, yes, like, people aren't making as many deals, but a lot of LPs are like doing callbacks on their monies from funds. There's a lot of money ready to be deployed. And we're in this space where there's both like a technological revolution happening, and there's a lot of money to get it done, which is actually a really good thing, because you want to find the people who have the money, and you want to do the really crazy technological thing. And so when I hear about data moat, I mean, part of me is, I agree with you. I'm like, how is a founder supposed to know exactly how things are going to play out? You can have some sort of like hypothetical vision about what your data moat is going to be in the future. But I actually think there are so few startups, starting that are just doing genuinely really hard things that most people say are a bad idea to do. And so you wonder like, okay, well, why is OpenAI taking off? They started and they're like, we're gonna build AGI. Like most people are like, that's ridiculous. Like you're gonna build AGI. I actually think it is like the best moment to try to start a company if you know how to assemble that team and you believe in yourself to build something that is like ambitious. And this is as someone like, I know there's like a technical skill gap, but there's so much that happens with building a company and putting the right team members together against the right mission that I think a lot of people undervalue, frankly. And so an example of this would be, I invested in a bunch of biotech companies, worst biotech investor ever, like all of them failed. But one of the great things is that I got to meet a bunch of biotech founders. And I was talking to my friend, I won't name his name just for confidentiality reasons, but he basically has a company that constructs these like targeted drug and diagnostic systems based on protein folding, based off of machine learning tech that's like 6-7 years old. And this is a multi-billion-dollar company. And I was talking to him and he's like, I really want to sell my company just so I can start this again with the deep learning that exists today, because I know where all of the data is at these pharmaceutical companies. And he was like, my fear is that some kid who's 22 is going to figure this out and he's going to pitch the same thing and someone's going to give him money. Or her. Sorry. And so I think that, like, honestly, when I hear about data moat, I just think, like there's a lot. I can't wait to see the companies that are just getting pitched by people who have no business starting these companies, who are like, this can be done. And so right now I see a lot of like, let's do AI for like this specific workflow or like these internal tools, which is super valuable. Like we should still do that. But when I hear the data moat question, I'm like, maybe what the investors are like really looking for are these moonshot ideas. Obviously, I think they're also going to lose out because their whole job is about deploying capital. And so if they're only looking for those ideas, they're going to miss out on all of the other layers of the stack that are evolving. And so I don't really have like a direct answer for your question. I just think like my opinion is that there could be a lot more ambitious companies today than there currently are.
Just a quick follow-up, like if you were pitching Loom today to an investor, what would your answer be?
If I were pitching Loom today and nothing like it existed?
Or just today, in today's environment?
I mean, I think my answer would be, okay, like it depends on how I dial up my risk tolerance. I have like a pretty high tolerance for risk. If I dial it down, I might say, well, there's a bunch of, big tech that's happening right now. Like there's a bunch of these big tech companies that need to like expand their product portfolios. And why wouldn't they tackle this? This makes total sense because it's a new data spigot for their company to build their models off of. So that's one answer. If I were to dial it up, I'd say, oh, this application layer doesn't exist today. If we're seeing initial traction and we know remote work is something that many people in tech are currently embedded in, and there's this use case that I would basically say, let me see you build it first. Let me see what the traction looks like. And if the traction even looks like a smidge of promising, I'd be like, okay, well, this makes total sense because it's a totally different type of data than exists today. But it's hard for me to answer that question because the market and the technology now is just so different from, like my answer to that question is like, it's hard because that's like a SaaS application layer. I guess like if I were to think about it as what SaaS companies would I build today? I am personally really drawn to just like solving really dumb problems for like antiquated industries that need it, where there's a lock-in. Like that's where I'm like really interested in SaaS versus super innovative new technology. But there's also a ton of opportunity for new technology innovation, like even within video. Like there's a ton that can happen there between, like the runway ML of the world to Sora. I was just talking to you about this. And so there's a ton you can do with like, well, what are your video marketing teams? What do they spend their money on? What's their budget? And so there's a ton of studio-based SaaS applications there. So I don't really know. It's like a terrible question or answer to your question. terrible answer to your question. But I prefer within SaaS, like kind of dumb SaaS right now. That's like kind of where I'm focused.
Same. Can you talk to us about what that process was like selling your company at Atlassian? You yourself said product kind of sucks. What were the things that really need to align for that sale to go through? And what were the things that you knew you didn't want to compromise on and you want to push back to make that acquisition go through?
Yeah, for sure. So me and Joe have had relationships with Mike and Scott, the two co-founders and co-CEOs of Atlassian, for over 5 years now. And so this is a relationship that's been building for a long time. Atlassian was one of our largest enterprise customers. They were early believers in the product. They understood how async video worked. And honestly, it wasn't the first acquisition offer that they had given us. We had a lot of time to build up a perspective about their character and how they were thinking about their products and their company. And, like to give you one of many examples, right before the SVB bank crisis, when we didn't know we were going to make payroll or not the next week, right before that, we had a major security incident where basically if you went onto loom.com, you could be logged in as somebody else randomly, and it would keep switching. It was like password sharing on steroids. It was like the worst security incident you could possibly have. And I was CTO, so I was on these calls with customers. I wasn't sure how much revenue we were going to lose. I was talking to a lot of very angry people who were like, hey, like the content that might have been disclosed, if that happens, you're going to get like audited by governments. And so it was like a really dark time. And Scott, one of the co-founders, reached out to us and he's like, hey, where do I wire like $10 million right now just to help you? He's like, I don't need anything in return. Just return it to me within like the next year or so. He's like, I just want to help you guys because you're going through a pretty like monstrously shitty time. And so there's like a ton of different examples of this, but I think that for me and my co-founder, like I said, we're kind of hippies. So like vibe is actually really important to us. And Mike and Scott are really smart, industrious capitalists who are just really good people. On the other end, when it comes to their products, I think they've been doing SaaS longer than most SaaS companies. They've been doing SaaS since the very beginning. They basically invented it, in my opinion, like with Jira and Confluence. And so I think talking to them about what they were very real about with the flaws of their own products and where they want to take that, talking about the strategy of where the company is going, that was another alignment check. For diligence, it's just like generally a pretty, it's not like a very pleasurable experience. It's like you're basically like answering thousands of questions for like, the FTC and then like all these government bodies, these other like 3 acronym government bodies. And you have a very short amount of time to get this done to align with financial schedules, quarterly schedules that the public company is beholden to. And so it was basically just like 2-3 months of meeting a bunch of their team, answering the same questions over and over again. But in the end, answering each person on the executive or leadership team, you don't want to like disclose this information to your company. And so you try to keep the team as tight as possible. And what ends up happening is each person ends up answering like, many thousands of questions about compliance and security and the technical moat. And, like, what is your open source compliance? How many lawsuits have you had in the past? That's obviously at Loom scale. If you're smaller, like the process might be lighter. But yeah, it was just like generally a pretty unpleasant experience that was smoother than most companies. I think Atlassian, the good thing is because they're good people, they have pretty standard terms. It's not super predatory. We didn't have to go back and forth on red lines where we were like, why did you try to slip this in? This feels shitty. And so that really helped speed up the process. And so it only took us 3 months end to end, which if you think about some of the other acquisitions at, not $1 billion, $975 million, it's kind of crazy that it happened 3 months end to end. Like that's pretty astounding. So overall, that was my experience.
Hi there. So you mentioned when you were describing the AI that Loom was incorporating, that some of it is a bit spooky, you have to have internal conversations about doing it anyway. Could you describe, even if it's at a high or vibes level, how you're thinking this through? A lot of us are building stuff, we have no idea what's going on next. And so we also need to figure out how we think about these unforeseen potential of dark.
Totally. Well, first of all, you have an awesome accent. I'm sure everybody else is thinking that. Makes you instantly sound smart and sophisticated. Unlike mine, I started smoking weed way too early. Yeah, I mean, like the way that like all of Atlassian has like an ethical technology review template, which like a lot of this stuff sounds like bullshitty, but it's actually pretty good. And we think through a lot of things. We think through basically all of the abuse vectors that could happen. Because if you think about it, like if someone could create a Loom account and then upload a bunch of videos of you onto it, and then generate all these videos and send it to other people, like that's not a good thing, right? And so what are we thinking about? We're thinking about like digital stenography. Like how do we make sure that there's like authentication of the content? This is like actively a space that's like evolving outside of Atlassian. We're thinking about how do we verify someone's voice if they want to use these features? Like make it opt-in. How do we make sure that they know what's going on? And if they want someone to use something that sounds like them, they have to actually grant access on Loom's platform. And if somebody else tries to use their voice, they can't. And so we're trying to think about all of these things. We're also not trying to like block shipping completely in order to ship all this stuff. I think that's like a losing strategy because the space is evolving so quickly. And there is something about like value capture and time to market, especially with how fast the video space is heating up with AI. And so that's really what we're thinking about. Like a lot of it is like the responsibility of how the technology will be used, but we're also like deeply thinking about the technology that makes that possible. Because if there isn't some automated way to do this, it's like already the scale that Loom's at, like this is gonna get abused immediately. There's like a bunch of content that gets recorded on our platform that I wish didn't get recorded on our platform, but it's just the nature of the scale that we're at. And so, yeah, I think that's mostly what I mean by like responsibly thinking about the technology and how we deploy it. We are lucky in the sense that we're only deploying the application layer, so we're not exposing like a text-to-speech or lip sync. Like we're not exposing APIs that let you do this. We're unlocking it in our product, and the explicit idea is that you're only using this to make videos that sound and look like you, not like other people. And so we're lucky that we're kind of like somewhat siloing the attack vector, but it's still there. And so we're really thinking about like all of those automated systems.
To add a little bit to that, it's particularly scary if we think about kind of where we are today in terms of the ability, you know, if you think about just how much is Instagram's algorithm, Twitter's algorithm, if there is one at all, other than just show me Elon's tweets, how much, let's say, the Instagram algorithm is actively shaping our behavior and our well-being, and it has been for years, right? And you know, like Meta is doing very well right now. The reason Meta is doing very well right now is Apple cut them off at the knees 2 years ago in terms of all the data they got, and thus they massively invested in AI over the last 2 years, and you know they're way ahead of everyone else in the process. But the way that's being translated is it's just showing you better ads and other things like Reels that are more likely to get you to stick around. And so that's great for them. It's probably not great for all of us. And so if we think about when everybody else catches up, and more importantly, when AI just continues to advance, it's kind of like the most important thing is, are the companies that you're choosing to use their products, like are they committed to something other than just sort of a capitalist bottom line around, you know, I get the most engagement, which means I generate the most revenue, and that's what my algorithm is optimized for. And we're not there today, clearly. And so it's extremely important that, you know, entrepreneurs like the folks in this room, like start thinking about the broader context of like sort of human-centered AI and like outcome-generated AI, where like the point is, you know, the real answer for me, at least, and what I'm trying to build with the products we're building now, is the ability for the user to have sort of fine controls of, what am I optimizing for? What is the algorithm built to do at the end of the day? And I wish more folks would do that. The problem is, as a small company, you can do that. When you take external investment, you've got returns, it gets harder. If you're a public company, it's basically impossible. I think when Google first set out to say, like, don't be evil, they meant it. And they were really pushing against that. And then, when you get to the size of Google, it's very, very, very difficult. And so I think there's an extremely important kind of like turning point that's coming in the next few years when it comes to all these things and how they affect us, because the AI is going to get that much better. It's going to become essentially a part of your own psyche. And so that, just completely elevates how important, all these discussions are. So it's a really timely time to be at least having them. Abby?
I was going to say there's a book exactly to all of these points called Filter World by Kyle Chaika, who's a New Yorker staff writer, and it just came out this year, right? But it's basically how algorithms flatten culture. And people say, like, oh, the algorithm showed this to me, right? But isn't it like the question is, was it your interests that then dictated what the algorithm was showing it to you, or the language we're using of the algorithm showed it to me and trained me, right? So I recommend, checking out the book exactly to the points that you're talking about.
Yeah, also Tobias Rose Stockwell's Outrage Machine is great as well on that front. I hope the flip side is that you can get your own AI to fight back against all of these things. And that's really what's going to happen is like it's all already starting, but it's just basically competing AIs for all of these things. And at least one that, you own that you can buy, right? You're paying for it. It's going to have those things in mind in a deeper sense than, somebody who's essentially monetizing your
The AI stuff is cool. You guys sound like an economics guy, and I say economics. I'm curious, what are a couple of papers or books that you like to use as references when it comes to thinking about the sense of models for stakeholders in whatever future we're building? AI is a part of the future, but then it may be other parts of the future. Is there like specific references, books, papers that you come back to?
I would say Ronald Coase, but I haven't actually read him in a long time. It's the wrong answer, but unfortunately it's Twitter. You follow the right people on Twitter, and these are the discussions that are happening all the time. And at least for me, that's the differentiation between I really try to avoid Instagram. Twitter, if you tune it properly, can be super, super positive. Now, again, what we really need is a filter on top of that to say, don't show me these things, or maybe, put this in a box and show it to me a certain time. But what's fascinating is, I probably suffer from the same things as everyone else. Just don't read as many books as you used to. But the two, actually, now that I mentioned it, they're very interesting, is there's this amazing book called Slouching Towards Utopia by J. Bradford DeLong, which just talks about kind of the arc of kind of both moral economics as well as just economics broadly, and how we went off course a while ago and some of the things you can do to bring them back. And the other one is a couple books by Darren Acemoglu, who's this amazing economist around why nations fail. And then he has a newer book, which is a name I can't remember, that's around, just what's happening with technology. The problem is he does a very good job of diagnosing the problem, like everyone else does. Tobias does that too. Everyone else does that. But then solutions are a little bit scarcer because that's the world we live in, unfortunately.
Okay.
Cheers.
So you were talking about the innovator's dilemma and going back to the actual startup process and the investment process and everything like that. Have you found it difficult to somehow engage with enterprise customers, et cetera, who maybe haven't been disrupted for a really long time? And then you have companies that are in, you guys are working in startup studios and innovation studios who might have some really great technologies that might be disruptive to these enterprise companies. Do you find it really difficult to, number one, work with those potential customer bases? And also, do you also find that it's hard to get investment into those companies that might be disruptive to different industries in general?
Yeah, it is just super easy to work with those people. It's a bad delivery, bad joke, but it is. It's really interesting because Loom at the core is a communication product, and so the way that we sell to enterprises is to first ask about what are your communication workflows? Like, how do your teams work together? Where do they need better async practices? And there's a period where I spent a lot of my time, unfortunately, with a bunch of CDOs, which are like chief digital officers, and CDTOs, which are like chief digital transformation officers, and CIOs. And it was like horrible, you know? It was horrible. And yeah, I mean, like they're in these industries like DHL or, you know, they're like UBS. And these are like massive companies that are not going to get disrupted anytime soon. Like there's a bunch of market forces that are keeping them in place. And they don't understand what you want to sell them, but there are people within those organizations whose jobs are to try to understand. And so it is really difficult. I find that as much as understanding how to sell a solution, it's equally as important to understand how to navigate egos. That's been my experience. If you know how to do that, like you're going to do really well selling into those folks. But yeah, it's really hard, and it takes a long time because the way that they think about these sales, these are like, you know, eventually they're thinking about multiple, like table stakes is like multiple millions per year, but like sometimes up to like 100 million per year on just your tool. And so they want to build these relationships that take a really long time. And a lot of startups, Loom included, we jumped the gun on thinking because our solution could work within enterprises, we were ready to sell to enterprises, which is just like, there's like many mistakes that founders will just continue to make no matter how much advice they get. And this is one of them that we made. And you know, fast forward now we're like a lot better equipped to sell to some of those industries, but not all of them. And the sales cycle is really, really long. And so, yeah, I mean, it's super tough.
But now how do you get them to invest in ecosystems and innovation versus individual companies where they may be able to kind of broaden things and find multiple companies that might come out of the ideas and disruptors that might be in the particular industries? Or do they not want to do it at all either?
I sat next to, basically I was at one of these CIO dinners, and as you guys can tell, I have like a very low filter. And so that is mostly sometimes good, sometimes bad. And in this case at this dinner, I was just ragging on ESG for like 20 minutes straight. And the guy next to me was at BlackRock, and he was like, I'm the guy who created ESG. And I was like, great, awesome. And the reason I bring that up, I think that like the investment ethos behind a company, like there's so like at that scale, there are so many competing incentives for why they might want to do that, right? Like we were talking about NVIDIA, like they literally had to create markets to sell their products to. Some of these companies are thinking about markets that are, you know, 10, 20, 30 years out. And so their investment strategy and thesis and how they deploy their capital, that's just kind of cash on hand. That really depends on what their strategic focus is as a company. And so that might be transformation of how their team works together. A lot of times it is. That's why there's that CDO role, or at least that's my understanding. Could be wrong there. But sometimes it's investments into totally different markets and like doing, you know, bullshit carbon capture. And so that's what BlackRock does. Yeah.
All right. I think that's a wrap. Thank you, Vinay.
Cool. Thanks all.